The most dangerous thing in the galaxy isn't a weapon. It's a human who decides not to fight. Rain hammered against the armored limousine hard enough to sound like gravel dumped onto metal roofing. Neon reflections bled across the wet streets of Varellus Prime, while traffic drones floated silently between towers that disappeared into the clouds nearly half a mile overhead. Inside the diplomatic convoy, the air smelled faintly of ozone, expensive perfume, and overheated circuitry. Ambassador Lasara Vale sat perfectly still in the rear passenger seat. One elegant blue-violet leg crossed over the other as lines of glowing alien text scrolled across the holographic display near her wrist. Her silver-white hair shimmered beneath the cabin lights like threads of frozen moonlight. Across from her, two Valoran security officers stood rigid with plasma carbines held close to their armor. Neither of them looked comfortable. Not because of the storm outside, because of the human in the front seat. Ethan Cole kept both hands on the steering controls as the limousine glided through the flooded avenue. 6'3", broad shoulders, black diplomatic uniform pulled tight across a body built by Earth gravity and years of military conditioning. A thin scar disappeared beneath the collar near his throat. Another crossed the back of his hand. He hadn't spoken in almost 20 minutes. The silence bothered the aliens more than shouting ever could. "Human," Lasara finally said coldly, not looking up from her display. "Your reaction time slowed by 0.7 seconds at the last intersection." Ethan's eyes remained on the rain-slick road ahead. Traffic density increased. "Excuses," she replied. One of the guards shifted uneasily. Everyone in the vehicle knew the rumors about humans from Earth. Deathworlders. Predators evolved on a planet where nearly everything could kill them. Heavy gravity, violent weather, endless wars. The galaxy tolerated humans because they were useful. But trust? Trust was harder. A loud crack rolled through the city as thunder echoed between skyscrapers. Ethan adjusted the steering wheel slightly. Smooth. Controlled. Lasara watched him now, golden, eyes narrowing faintly. "You people enjoy danger too much," she said. "That explains your species' obsession with conflict." Ethan said nothing. That irritated her more. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." Slowly, Ethan glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Gray eyes. Calm. Empty as winter steel. No challenge in them. No fear either. Lasara hated that most of all. On Valora, lower ranks bowed instinctively before authority. But humans didn't bend correctly. Even when obedient, they felt dangerous. The convoy slowed as crowds gathered ahead near the central transit bridge. Protesters pressed against security barriers beneath glowing signs demanding the removal of off-world diplomats. Rain poured over hundreds of umbrellas and illuminated masks. The guards immediately tightened their grip on their weapons. "Keep moving," Lasara ordered sharply. "Yes, Ambassador." Ethan guided the limo carefully through the narrow corridor between barricades. Then something hit the side of the vehicle. Clang. Another impact followed. Louder this time. One protester had slipped past security drones. The young alien slammed both palms against Ethan's window, screaming something unintelligible through the storm. The guards instantly raised their weapons. Ethan did not. He simply stopped the vehicle for half a second to avoid running the civilian over. That hesitation snapped something inside Lasara. Unbelievable. Before anyone could react, she leaned forward and struck Ethan across the face. The sound cracked through the cabin harder than the thunder outside. Silence swallowed the limo instantly. One guard inhaled sharply. The other went completely still. Ethan's head turned slightly from the impact. Rain streaked down the windshield in slow rivers. For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. Then the dashboard flickered red. Warning. Human stress response detected. The guards' faces drained of color. One of them slowly lowered his weapon away from Ethan instead of toward him. Because every Valoran officer knew the stories. A frightened human was dangerous. An angry human was catastrophic. But Ethan Cole simply faced forward again and rested his hand back on the steering. Controls. Calm. Controlled. Like nothing had happened at all. And somehow, that terrified them even more. The rain finally stopped as the convoy crossed into the upper districts of Varellus Prime, but the silence inside the limousine only grew heavier. Neon lights drifted across Ethan Cole's face in slow pulses of blue and crimson, while the city climbed around them in endless towers of chrome and black glass. Nobody spoke, not even the guards. Ambassador Lasara Vale kept her gaze fixed on the glowing skyline outside her window, though her reflection betrayed the tension in her golden eyes. She had expected anger, maybe defiance. Humans were famous for emotional instability. At least that was what the Academy reports claimed. But the human in front of her had absorbed humiliation the same way stone absorbed rain. Quietly, without reaction. That unsettled her far more than shouting would have. One of the guards finally cleared his throat. "Ambassador," he said carefully, "perhaps we should rotate the driver at the next checkpoint." Ethan did not react. Lasara tilted her head slightly. "Why?" The guard hesitated. "Protocol regarding Deathworld species stress responses." She almost laughed at that. "He is a driver, not a war machine." Neither guard answered. Their silence said enough. The limousine entered the diplomatic district moments later. Massive shield generators hummed overhead, bathing the streets in a pale silver glow, while security drones floated between the buildings like silent metal insects. Ethan guided the vehicle beneath the entrance arch of the Senate spire with mechanical precision. Tires hissed softly against wet pavement. The engine powered down. Only then did Ethan finally speak. "We have arrived, Ambassador." His voice was low, controlled. American accent softened by years off Earth. Lasara studied him for a moment before stepping out of the vehicle. The cold night air carried the scent of ionized rain and distant engine fuel. Hundreds of lights shimmered across the enormous Senate complex ahead of them. Alien diplomats from dozens of systems moved through the marble courtyard beneath hovering banners of gold and violet. Yet more than a few. Eyes drifted toward Ethan. Humans always attracted attention, especially Earthborn humans. A pair of junior diplomats near the stairs whispered to each other as Ethan walked past. "That is him," one asked quietly. "The Terran. I heard he served in the frontier conflicts." "Impossible." They said those soldiers were unstable. Ethan ignored them completely. He opened Lasara's door with the same calm professionalism as before. No bitterness. No resentment. Just duty. For some reason, that irritated her again. "You are very good at pretending," she said quietly while the guards moved ahead. Ethan met her gaze. "Pretending what?" "That you are harmless." The corner of his jaw tightened slightly. "Barely noticeable." "I am harmless, Ambassador." Somewhere high above the Senate towers, thunder rolled again. Lasara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The galaxy does not fear humans without reason." Ethan glanced toward the distant skyline, where storm clouds crawled above the city lights. Earth feared itself long before the galaxy did. That answer caught her off guard. Before she could respond, the Senate alarm suddenly pulsed once across the courtyard. Low. Mechanical. Every security drone froze midair for half a second. Then all the lights flickered. Ethan's eyes immediately shifted upward. Alert. Focused. Different. Not a driver anymore. The transformation was subtle but terrifying. One guard frowned nervously. That is not normal. A second later, every holographic screen in the district went dark at once. And somewhere deep beneath the city, something exploded. The floor trembled beneath the Senate courtyard hard enough to rattle the marble beneath their feet. A deep metallic groan rolled through the lower levels of the city while lights flickered across the massive towers surrounding them. For one strange second, the entire diplomatic district seemed to hold its breath. Then panic began. Alien officials hurried across the courtyard in clusters, their polished composure collapsing beneath rising confusion. Security drones dropped from the air one after another, crashing against the wet pavement with showers of sparks. Somewhere above, emergency sirens finally came alive in long mechanical pulses that echoed between the skyscrapers. Ethan Cole moved before anyone else did. "Inside," he said sharply. One of the guards straightened immediately at the tone in his voice. Not because Ethan shouted, because he sounded like someone used to being obeyed. Lasara noticed it too. The human stepped between her and the open courtyard while his eyes scanned the Senate balconies, windows, rooftops, exits. Constant movement. Constant calculation. "We do not even know what happened," she protested. "Power disruption," Ethan replied. "Too coordinated to be random." Another low boom vibrated through the district. Closer this time. The nearest crowd screamed as part of a holographic billboard shattered overhead, raining harmless fragments of light into the air before vanishing completely. Ethan placed one hand lightly against Lasara's shoulder and guided her toward the Senate entrance. The touch lasted less than a second. Professional. Controlled. Yet her pulse jumped anyway. Not from fear of him. From the realization that his body had become tense in a way she had not seen before. Focused. Predatory. The guards hurried after them through the towering Senate doors as emergency shutters began sealing sections of the building. Inside, the atmosphere felt even worse. Hundreds of diplomats crowded the central atrium beneath enormous glowing chandeliers, while security personnel shouted conflicting orders into communicators that no longer worked properly. The air smelled of hot circuitry and overheated generators. Ambassador Vale, a silver-skinned official, called out while rushing toward them. There has been an attack on the lower transit grid. We are initiating lockdown procedures. Ethan's eyes narrowed immediately. Transit grid. Multiple explosions beneath the Eastern District. The official replied nervously. Communications are failing across half the city. Ethan looked upward toward the dark security cameras lining the ceiling. This was planned. Lasara crossed her arms tightly. By whom? No one answered. That silence frightened her more than the alarms. A group of Senate guards suddenly pushed through the crowd carrying portable scanners. Their commander stopped the moment he saw Ethan. Human recognition flashed across his face immediately. You, the commander said cautiously. Ethan met his gaze without expression. Problem? No, the alien replied too quickly. Just protocol. The commander's scanner emitted a sharp chirping sound as it passed near Ethan's body. Warning. Enhanced human physiology detected. Several nearby diplomats immediately stepped backward. One whispered quietly, Deathworld military. Another muttered something about Earth campaigns near the frontier systems. Lasara stared at Ethan in disbelief. You told me you were a driver. I am. That scanner identified combat modifications. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Old ones. Before she could demand another answer, every light inside the atrium died at once. Darkness swallowed the Senate chamber instantly. Gasps echoed through the room. Then came the sound. Heavy impacts from somewhere above them. Slow. Deliberate. Like something moving through the ventilation structure. Ethan's hand immediately reached behind his back beneath the diplomatic coat. The movement was instinctive. Familiar. Lasara heard one of the guards whisper under his breath. Stars protect us. He came armed. Then red emergency lights flickered on across the atrium one row at a time, painting everyone in blood-colored shadows, while Ethan Cole looked up toward the ceiling with the cold expression of a man who had survived this kind of nightmare before. The impacts above the ceiling grew louder. Slow at first, then faster. Metal groaned somewhere deep inside the ventilation shafts while frightened diplomats pressed together beneath the flickering red emergency lights. The Senate atrium no longer looked like the center of galactic civilization. It looked like prey waiting in the dark. Ethan Cole stepped slightly in front of Ambassador Lasara Vale, without even seeming aware he had done it. Instinct. His gray eyes tracked the ceiling vents, the balconies, the sealed exits. Every possible threat. One of the Senate guards approached nervously, weapon shaking just enough to notice. Human, he said carefully, state your military affiliation. Ethan never looked at him. Inactive. That is not an answer. It is the only one you are getting. Before the guard could respond, the lights failed again. Total darkness crashed over the atrium. Someone screamed nearby. Another diplomat dropped a datapad that shattered loudly against the marble floor. Then came a sharp metallic hiss above them. Ethan moved instantly. Down. His voice cut through the darkness like a blade. Lasara barely had time to react before Ethan grabbed her arm and pulled her sideways behind one of the massive support pillars. A split second later, part of the ceiling collapsed near the center of the atrium in a storm of sparks and smoke. Panic exploded through the chamber. Security personnel rushed in every direction while alarms screamed overhead. Through the haze, several dark figures dropped silently from the damaged ventilation shaft wearing matte black armor with no insignias. Professional. Organized. One of the guards raised his weapon, but the intruders disabled it instantly with a pulse of blue static that rippled across the room. The weapon died in his hands. Electronic suppression, Ethan muttered. Lasara stared at him. How do you know that? Ethan slowly pulled something from beneath his diplomatic coat. Not a rifle. Not military hardware. Just a compact matte black sidearm worn smooth from years of use. The nearest guard looked horrified. Stars above. Ethan ignored him completely. Stay behind me. he told Lasara. That is an order. She almost argued out of reflex. Then she saw his face beneath the red emergency lights. Cold. Focused. Not emotional. Not angry. Worse. Experienced. One of the armored intruders scanned the crowd before locking onto Lasara's position. Target identified. A distorted mechanical voice echoed through the chamber. Every instinct inside her suddenly turned to ice. This attack had always been about her. Ethan shifted forward slightly. Calmly. Like a wall moving into place. The intruders advanced through the smoke while terrified officials scattered around them. Yet Ethan did not rush. Did not panic. He simply watched their formation with frightening patience. 3 moving. Left, he said quietly. 2 holding center. 1 overwatch near the balcony. Lasara blinked in disbelief. How can you possibly know that? Ethan's eyes never left the shadows. Because this is how humans hunt. Another pulse of static burst across the atrium, killing the remaining lights entirely. The only illumination now came from emergency strips glowing dim red along the floor. The chamber looked submerged in blood-colored water. One of the intruders lunged toward their position through the smoke. Ethan moved faster than Lasara thought possible for someone his size. 1 step. 1 controlled motion. The attacker crashed hard into a marble column before sliding unconscious to the floor. No wasted movement. No rage. Just brutal efficiency. Silence hit the area around them instantly. Even the remaining intruders hesitated. One whispered something sharply over a comm channel. Ethan heard it. His expression darkened slightly. They know what I am now, he said. Lasara's golden eyes widened. What are you? For the first time since she met him, Ethan looked tired instead of emotionless. Thunder rumbled faintly above the city while smoke drifted through the ruined Senate chamber. Someone Earth-built for very bad days. Smoke drifted slowly through the ruined Senate chamber while emergency lights pulsed overhead in exhausted red flashes. Somewhere in the distance, security alarms still screamed across the city, but inside the atrium, the noise had changed. Less panic now. More fear. Real fear. The kind that settled deep into alien bones when survival instincts finally woke up. Ethan Cole moved through the haze with one hand lightly guiding Ambassador Lasara Vale behind him. His footsteps stayed steady despite the shattered marble beneath their boots. Around them, diplomats huddled behind pillars or overturned tables while stunned security officers struggled to reactivate dead equipment. Nobody tried stopping Ethan anymore. Nobody questioned his orders. Eastern corridor, he said quietly. Move. One of the surviving guards blinked in confusion. How do you know the attackers are not there? Ethan glanced toward the ceiling where smoke curled around broken ventilation panels. Because if I were hunting us, I would expect everyone to avoid the obvious exit. The guard swallowed hard and obeyed immediately. Lasara noticed that. A few hours ago, these same officers barely concealed their distrust toward the human driver. Now trained security personnel followed him without hesitation. The realization disturbed her more than she wanted to admit. They entered a narrow maintenance corridor lit only by dim emergency strips along the floor. The walls vibrated faintly from distant impacts beneath the city. Pipes hissed overhead. Condensation rolled down cold steel surfaces in silver streams. Ethan finally slowed near a sealed service door and pressed his hand against the metal. Listening. Waiting. Clear, he murmured. The small group slipped inside what appeared to be an abandoned transit control room. Dust covered the old consoles. Half the monitors were dark. The others flickered weakly with broken surveillance feeds from around Varellus Prime. Fires burned in several districts now. Entire streets had lost power. One camera showed crowds fleeing through heavy rain, while damaged drones fell from the sky like dead birds. Lasara stared at the screens in disbelief. This is impossible. Ethan checked the room quickly before locking the door behind them. No, he replied calmly. Just expensive. One of the guards lowered himself into a chair with shaking hands. Who would attack the Senate during peace negotiations? Ethan removed the compact sidearm from beneath his coat and checked the power cell with practiced movements. Someone who profits from war. Lasara folded her arms tightly. You speak as though you have seen this before. Ethan looked at the dark monitor beside him for a long moment before answering. Too many times. Silence settled over the room again. But it felt different now. Heavier. More personal. Lasara watched Ethan carefully while he moved toward the corner sink and rinsed soot from his hands. The red emergency lights painted the old scars across his knuckles in dull crimson lines. Not ceremonial scars. Not cosmetic modifications like wealthy military officers wore. These looked earned. You were. Not simply military, she said quietly. Ethan dried his hands slowly with a cloth hanging nearby. No, then what were you? He did not answer immediately. Outside the room, thunder rolled faintly across the city. Somewhere deep below them, another distant explosion vibrated through the floor. Ethan finally leaned against the old control console with exhausted eyes fixed on nothing. Earth had places where diplomacy stopped working, he said. I was sent to those places. One of the guards stared at him nervously. The frontier conflicts. Ethan gave a small nod. The guard's face drained of color. Even Lasara recognized the name. Entire systems destabilized. Pirate fleets erased. Insurgent colonies collapsed overnight. Rumors spread through the galaxy for years afterward about what Earth's specialized units had done during those wars. Most civilized species assumed the stories were exaggerated propaganda. Looking at Ethan now, Lasara suddenly wondered if the stories had actually been censored. A soft sound interrupted the silence. Metallic scraping somewhere beyond the corridor door. Everyone froze instantly. The guards reached for dead weapons that still would not power on. Ethan slowly looked toward the entrance. Calm again. Focused again. Like some ancient survival instinct had fully awakened beneath his skin. Then he quietly removed his jacket and handed it to Lasara. Put this on, he said. It is cold down here. She blinked in surprise. This is hardly the time for, trust me. For the first time since meeting him, his voice sounded tired instead of emotionless. Lasara took the jacket without understanding why. It was still warm from his body. The scraping sound beyond the corridor door stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Silence returned to the abandoned control room, thick and unnatural. Even the distant alarms outside seemed quieter now, muffled beneath layers of steel and concrete deep under Varela's prime. Ethan Cole stood motionless near the entrance with one hand resting loosely near his sidearm while the others watched him breathe. Slow, steady, controlled, like a man forcing himself to remain human through sheer discipline. Ambassador. Lasara Vale pulled his jacket tighter around her shoulders without realizing it. The fabric smelled faintly of rain, machine oil, and cold air. Human scents. Strange how something so ordinary suddenly felt grounding inside this nightmare. One of the guards finally whispered, "Should we move?" Ethan tilted his head slightly toward the door. Listening again. Not yet. You think they found us? I think they expected us to hide. The guard swallowed hard. How can you always tell what they are going to do? Ethan glanced toward the flickering security monitors lining the wall. Because fear makes people predictable. Lasara folded her arms tighter beneath the oversized jacket. You speak as though fear does not affect humans. Ethan looked at her then. Really looked at her for the first time since the attack began. His gray eyes seemed older beneath the emergency lights. Older than any human should have looked. Fear affects humans more than most species, he said quietly. Earth just taught us to keep moving anyway. Another faint tremor rolled through the room. Dust drifted from the ceiling vents in soft gray clouds. On one broken monitor, the city above continued unraveling into chaos. Emergency broadcasts flashed across the damaged feed, while entire districts disappeared into darkness one block at a time. Lasara stared at the images with growing disbelief. The Senate defenses should never have failed this easily. Ethan nodded once. Which means someone inside helped them. The realization hit the room hard. One of the guards cursed softly under his breath. The other sank deeper into his chair, suddenly looking very young beneath his armor. Lasara turned back toward Ethan slowly. You already suspected that. Yes. Then why did you still bring me here? Ethan's expression did not change. Because it was the safest place in the city. She almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement while explosions echoed beneath the streets overhead. Safe. Compared to everywhere else. Before she could answer, a soft crying sound drifted faintly through the ventilation shaft above them. Everyone froze. Ethan's eyes lifted immediately toward the ceiling. The crying came again. Small. Frightened. A child. One of the guards shook his head sharply. It could be bait. Ethan listened for another second before moving toward the vent ladder along the far wall. Stay here. Lasara stepped forward instantly. Absolutely not. Ethan looked back at her calmly. If I do not come back in 5 minutes, lock the door behind me and keep moving east through the maintenance tunnels. You are giving me orders again. Yes. The honesty in his voice caught her completely off guard. No arrogance. No hostility. Just responsibility. Ethan climbed the ladder with quiet efficiency and forced open the old vent cover overhead. Cold air rushed down, carrying the smell of smoke and burned circuitry. The crying grew louder. A few moments later, Ethan disappeared into the darkness above them. Silence returned once more. Lysara stared upward without meaning to. One of the guards shifted nervously beside her. Ambassador, humans from Earth are different. I noticed. No, the guard whispered. I mean biologically. Their homeworld forced them to evolve for endurance. Higher pain tolerance. Faster reflexes. Aggression suppression training. Most species would collapse under prolonged stress responses. Lysara slowly looked back toward the dark ventilation shaft. And humans? The guard hesitated before answering. Humans keep functioning long after they should break. Several minutes passed before metal groaned softly overhead again. Ethan dropped back into the room carrying a small alien child wrapped in a thermal blanket. The little girl clung tightly to his neck with trembling blue hands while soot streaked her pale skin. Ethan lowered her carefully into one of the chairs before kneeling beside her to check her breathing. Gentle, patient. The child looked up at him with terrified eyes. Are the monsters gone? She whispered. Ethan gave the smallest shake of his head. Not yet. Then he handed her his own emergency ration bar without hesitation. Lysara stared at him in silence while red emergency lights flickered softly across the scars on his tired hands. And for the first time in her life, the alien diplomat began to understand why the galaxy feared Earth. The little girl fell asleep, clutching the emergency ration bar against her chest, while distant sirens echoed through the maintenance tunnels beneath the city. The abandoned control room had grown colder over the last hour. Moisture dripped steadily from overhead pipes, tapping softly against the steel floor like the ticking of a clock none of them could stop. Ethan Cole sat near the sealed door, cleaning soot from his sidearm with slow mechanical movements while the two guards whispered nervously beside the inactive consoles. Ambassador Lysara Vale watched him from across the room without pretending otherwise anymore. Something about the human disturbed every assumption she had ever been taught. Deathworlders were supposed to be unstable, aggressive, primitive beneath civilized uniforms. Yet Ethan moved with more restraint than most diplomats she had known. Even now, exhausted and hunted, he remained careful with the frightened child sleeping nearby. You have not rested once, Lysara said quietly. Ethan slid the power cell back into the weapon with a soft metallic click. Neither have you. I am not the one carrying everyone. He almost smiled at that. Almost. The expression vanished before it fully formed. Comes with the job. Driver? She asked. Or soldier? Ethan looked down at the old sidearm resting in his hands. There was not much difference where I came from. Before she could answer, the room lights flickered violently. Every monitor suddenly snapped back to life at once. Static flooded the screens in screaming bursts of white noise before stabilizing into distorted emergency broadcasts from across Varellus Prime. Entire districts burned beneath black smoke. Military drones filled the skies. Then a new image replaced the chaos. A masked figure appeared across every screen simultaneously. Tall, motionless, voice digitally distorted. Citizens of Varellus Prime, the figure announced calmly, the Senate has fallen. Surrender Ambassador Lysara Vale, and no further bloodshed will occur. One of the guards cursed under his breath. Lysara felt cold spread through her stomach. This was never about destabilization, she whispered. It was targeted. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the screen. Yes. The masked figure continued speaking while emergency lights pulsed red across the room. The ambassador carries information capable of destroying powerful interests within the Senate Alliance. We cannot allow those secrets to survive. The broadcast ended abruptly. Silence returned once more. Heavy, suffocating. One of the guards turned toward Lysara with visible panic. Ambassador, what are they talking about? She looked away. Ethan noticed immediately. You know something? Lysara hesitated. For the first time since this nightmare began, uncertainty cracked through her composure. 3 weeks ago, she said quietly, I discovered evidence of illegal weapons shipments moving through diplomatic channels. Someone inside the Senate has been funding conflicts across the frontier systems for years. Ethan's expression darkened. War profits. Yes. One guard stared at her in disbelief. You never reported this? I tried, she snapped. Every transmission disappeared before reaching Central Command. Ethan slowly stood. Then the Senate was compromised long before tonight. Another sound interrupted him. Footsteps. Multiple. Moving through the corridor outside the control room. Slow. Deliberate. The guards immediately stiffened. Ethan extinguished the nearest light panel with one quick motion, plunging half the room into darkness. How many exits? He asked quietly. Only the maintenance shaft, one guard whispered. Ethan nodded once. Take the child and move when I tell you. Lasara stepped forward instantly. What about you? Ethan checked the corridor door as shadows moved faintly beneath the gap at the bottom. I slow them down. There are too many. Probably. The calmness in his voice frightened her more than the footsteps outside. One of the guards whispered urgently, Human, they will kill you. Ethan glanced back toward the sleeping child bundled beneath his jacket, then toward Lasara. His tired gray eyes softened just slightly beneath the red emergency lights. Maybe, he said quietly, but they do not get to touch her. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. Then the handle began turning slowly. The handle turned slowly. Metal clicked softly inside the lock mechanism while everyone in the control room stopped breathing. The frightened child clutched Ethan Cole's jacket tighter around herself, her wide eyes fixed on the sealed door. Outside, heavy footsteps shifted against the corridor floor. Patient. Controlled. Whoever hunted them knew there was nowhere left to run. Ethan raised one hand toward the guards without taking his eyes off the entrance. Stay back. The gesture was small, but both trained officers obeyed instantly. Ambassador Lasara Vale realized something terrifying in that moment. None of them were relying on rank anymore. They were relying on him. Another metallic click echoed through the room. Then silence. Ethan's expression changed slightly. Move, he whispered. The guards immediately grabbed the child and rushed toward the maintenance shaft ladder along the rear wall. Lasara hesitated only a second before following them. Ethan. He looked back at her calmly. Go. You cannot stay here alone. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Tired. Sad. Ambassador. I have been alone a long time. Before she could answer, the control room door burst inward beneath a shower of sparks. Dark armored figures flooded into the entrance through smoke and flashing red emergency lights. Ethan moved instantly, fast enough that Lasara barely saw him draw the compact sidearm beneath his coat. Sharp bursts of light reflected across the steel walls while alarms screamed overhead. Ethan did not fight like the alien soldiers she had known. No wasted movement. No dramatic aggression. Every action looked terrifyingly efficient, like survival itself had been carved into his bones years ago. Go, he shouted again. This time she obeyed. The guards pulled Lasara toward the maintenance shaft while the child cried softly against one guard's shoulder. Behind them, the ruined control room vanished into smoke, sparks, and flashing emergency lights. The group climbed downward through narrow steel tunnels beneath the city while distant impacts echoed above them. The air smelled of rust, rainwater, and burned machinery. Somewhere, behind them, muffled sounds continued through the pipes. Then suddenly, silence. Lasara stopped climbing. No, one guard looked upward nervously. Ambassador, we must keep moving. He is still up there. And he chose that. The words hit harder than she expected. Because she knew it was true. Ethan had stayed behind fully expecting not to return. Not for glory. Not for recognition. Simply because someone needed to stand between danger and people too frightened to protect themselves. A deep ache settled in her chest. Guilt. Shame. She remembered the sound of her hand striking his face inside the limousine. Remembered the cold expression she had mistaken for arrogance. She had spent her entire life believing humans were dangerous because they lacked refinement. But Ethan Cole possessed more restraint than anyone she had ever met. They finally reached an abandoned transit platform nearly 200 feet beneath the city streets. Old maglev tracks disappeared into darkness, while broken advertisements flickered weakly across cracked walls. Rainwater dripped steadily from the ceiling. One guard activated a portable emergency beacon. Rescue teams may still be operating underground, he said quietly. Lasara barely heard him. Her eyes remained fixed on the tunnel behind them. Waiting. praying. Minutes crawled by. Then footsteps echoed faintly through the darkness. Slow, uneven. The guards raised their weapons instinctively. A figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the platform. Ethan. Smoke stained his black shirt nearly gray beneath the tunnel lights. One sleeve had been torn open, revealing old scars crossing his arm beneath fresh soot and rainwater. He looked exhausted beyond words. But alive. The child gasped softly and ran toward him before anyone could stop her. Ethan caught her carefully despite the obvious pain in his movements. Easy there, he murmured. You were supposed to stay behind the scary soldiers. The little girl buried her face against his chest. Lasara stared at him in stunned silence. You came back. Ethan looked genuinely confused by the statement. I said I would. She stepped closer slowly. Most people would have left us. Ethan glanced toward the dark tunnel behind him where distant sirens echoed beneath the sleeping city. His tired gray eyes softened slightly. Yeah, he said quietly. That is why Earth got tired of sending most people. Rain fell softly across Varellus Prime 3 days later. The fires were finally gone. Emergency drones drifted between the towering buildings repairing damaged transit lines, while Senate investigators flooded the upper districts searching for the officials responsible for the attacks. News broadcasts played constantly across the city now. Corruption networks exposed. Weapons trafficking routes dismantled. Several high-ranking senators arrested before dawn. The galaxy called it a political miracle. Ethan Cole called it Tuesday. The human stood quietly beside the diplomatic transport outside the temporary Senate chamber, with one hand tucked into the pocket of a fresh black coat. The bruising along his jaw had faded slightly beneath the pale morning light, though exhaustion still lived behind his gray eyes. Crowds filled the massive plaza beyond the security barriers. Journalists, citizens, survivors. Many stared openly at the human from Earth. Some with curiosity, others with fear. Ethan ignored all of them. He simply watched the rain slide down the polished surface of the transport vehicle while steam rose softly from the wet pavement. You are late. Ambassador Lasara Vale's voice carried gently through the rain behind him. Ethan turned. For a brief second, he almost did not recognize her. Gone was the cold ceremonial armor and jeweled diplomatic attire. Today she wore a simple dark silver coat with no symbols of rank. Her silver-white hair moved softly in the wind, while the rain reflected like liquid gold in her eyes. She looked lighter somehow, more real. Ethan straightened slightly. Security sweep took longer than expected. Lasara stepped closer beneath the falling rain. You are still acting like my bodyguard. Someone has to. A faint smile touched her lips. Small. Genuine. You realize the Senate has offered you command positions on 3 worlds now. Ethan looked away toward the skyline. I declined. Why? The question lingered. Between them, while thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the distant towers. Ethan finally shrugged. I spent too much of my life being useful for wars. Lasara studied him quietly. And now? Ethan glanced toward the crowded plaza where the small alien girl from the tunnels sat safely beside medical personnel eating breakfast beneath a thermal blanket. Now I drive people places. The simplicity of the answer hit her harder than any speech ever could. This man had survived conflicts that terrified entire star systems. He had protected people who insulted him, saved strangers who feared him, refused power when the galaxy practically begged him to take it. Not because he lacked strength, because he understood it too well. Lasara stepped toward the transport vehicle before pausing beside the passenger door. Several nearby guards watched curiously through the rain. Ethan instinctively moved to open the door for her. But before he could touch it, Lasara reached out first. The entire plaza seemed to fall silent. Alien guards stared openly as the ambassador herself opened the vehicle door for the human standing beside her. Ethan blinked once in visible surprise. Ambassador, she met his eyes steadily. My people spent centuries believing civilization meant power, she said softly. Then I met someone from Earth. Rain tapped gently against the roof of the transport, while distant city lights shimmered across the wet streets beyond them. Ethan looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then, very carefully, he lowered his head in the smallest respectful nod she had ever seen from him. Not obedience. Respect. Real respect. Lasara smiled faintly and stepped aside beside the open door. After you, Ethan Cole. The human hesitated before finally entering the vehicle. Around them, Stunned guards and diplomats continued staring in silence, while Rain drifted through the cold morning air. Because for the first time in the history of Varellus Prime, an alien diplomat had looked at a human Deathworlder and seen something greater than fear. She had seen mercy, and somehow, that was far more powerful.